Hi Noel. I had a really great time that first lesson that we had. There are a couple things I wanted to talk about in this video, just so you have some sort of audio example, maybe some little reminders about some of the things I suggested doing. The first thing we talked about, obviously, was that legato tongue, making sure it's very clean. I really like how even and constant your airflow is. That's constantly a problem for other people, but we just need to make sure you don't have those glissandi. So here's a couple exercises where you keep that constant airflow, but you know it's going to be clean because just that little bit of tongue driven by the air is going to make those notes different. So here's a couple exercises you can do to work on that. And like I said, keeping that constant airflow that you already have, and making sure it's separated with just a tiny bit of tongue. So really, the air is driving it, just a little bit of tongue is making the difference. And you can just keep making it more and more detached, just always using the glissando as a reference point to make sure your air is even. That way you really know your tongue is not doing most of the work, it's the air. So as long as you keep that in mind, I think you're going to sound great, like you already do. Just even more clear, even more defined. So that's one exercises. That's one of the exercises that you can do. There's a couple other ones. I really recommend having a metronome when you work on this. As far as the slide technique goes with it, if you're using a metronome and you know that your air is constant, that's going to make everything you play much more clear, really more in tune because the slide is working in a musical fashion like a bow because you're thinking musically and the slide is learning how to play in time but cleanly and clearly. So here is, for example, another exercises you can do. This one uses triplets. Legato. Now a little more detached. Keep it more detached. Wasn't really in tune, but I think for our purposes right now, that's going to be very helpful. You definitely want to play it in tune, but just doing exercises like that, where you know the airflow is consistent, you'll know that you're using the tongue correctly because the air is driving the music, and the tongue's just making a little more detachment, even though it's very light and clear. I think it'll be very easy for you just working from that fact that you have a very even airstream. We're just going to work on making sure the tongue is very light and riding on top of that airstream with that. So that Roshu that you're working on, if you do a similar exercise where you're glissing things first, you're going to know that your airflow is constant, but you're also going to be very able to add that little bit of legato tongue. So that way it's very smooth, yet very clear the entire time. So like we talked about, this is the way I'd like you to practice your Roshus, just to make sure that not only is it flowing music driven from the air, just a tiny bit of tongue making the difference, even though that's not what really is making the note. So then it's a little bit of legato tongue. Obviously, you're not going to need to use legato tongue for every slur. There's going to be certain things that are natural slurs. For our purposes, if you want to, you can tongue everything, but I think if you can work on knowing when that natural slur is going to happen, like between partials, the A to the D, it's just another musical effect. It sounds a little different than the other ones. The more you can tastefully make little differences in your articulation like that, the more musical it's going to be. You don't have to always have the same sort of legato. There's many different kinds of it, really. You can play a very smooth legato where it's very lyrical, very floaty. So like this, for example. It's borderline glissando. Honestly, there's almost a little portamento in there. Then you can do more of a rigid, more anthem-like legato. That's another thing you can do. So it's flowing, but it's just a little different style. If we're really thinking musically all the time, you can decide in the moment what your musical choice is. If it's going to be a little more rigid, it's going to be very suave, or somewhere in between. The more you work on your technique like that, you're going to be in the most control of your music like that. So we're going to do different kinds of practicing. One kind of practicing, we're working on the technique, making sure it's very clear, very even, very tasteful, just as far as sound goes. And then when you're actually making music, it's going to make it that much easier to just do it automatically. So we're not thinking about what we're actually doing, we're just thinking about the music. So like I said, with the Roshu, if you work on glissando first, and then just a little bit of legato tongue, eventually you'll be in complete control. You'll know that there's no glissandi that's going to happen, and you're going to be able to make more musical choices in the moment because you're going to be in complete technical control and you'll feel confident. So I really think with those things in mind, you're going to benefit a lot. And by the way, like I said, I really like your sound. I really like your flexibility. Let's build on that, especially with articulation. That constant airflow will be the biggest factor in making sure you have clean articulation. If the air is just riding on top of that air, if the tongue is just riding on top of that air, you know that it's going to be consistent articulation as long as the tongue is light. So you might even practice doing breath attacks, just so the tongue has as minimal roll as possible. I'm not going to do that right now, but if you work on how clear, how light can your articulation be, and that's really riding on the airstream, that's really going to help you make other articulation, other musical choices. So one way you can work on all your articulation with that one airstream example is to play any phrase with articulation glissed. So for one example, this is one exercise that I do as well. So you can play that gliss, and then you go right to being detached. So you know the airflow is consistent, and the tongue is just as light, no matter the detachment of the notes. So really, there's no difference between each phrase in terms of air. It's really to see a detachment of the articulation. Just a little bit of clear tongue, a little more detached on some of them, but the air is flowing all the time. And really the tongue is riding on it all the time. So here's another example. I like to do this kind of in a chromatic way. It doesn't matter what partial you're in. I just start in the F1, just making sure that it's as relaxed as possible, because any tension is going to make it harder to sound good on your instrument. So really, the air is the same, like I said, all the time. There's just a little bit of difference with the tongue. And as long as you practice it like that, you're going to keep the air the way it needs to be, and you're going to be able to make more musical choices in the moment. So really, when you're playing music, that musical thought in your head for how the music should sound will drive everything, and the technique will work exactly with it if you practice things like I'm suggesting. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I can definitely get you even more exercises to work on. I think the more simple, the better. That's one reason why when I'm first playing that note, before I play the rest of the run, I'm just working on the tongue rather than the airstream like that. So when I actually use the slide works evenly, and then the tongue is working the same way even though the slide is moving. So it's really simple exercise. The more simple, the better it is, because that way your body just learns how to do things, and when your mind wants to drive something with music, the body knows how to respond after practicing like that. So like I said, you're sounding great. Just use a couple of these things I'm suggesting. I think you'll find a lot of success making different musical choices in the moment. You're just going to have more at your disposal. So I hope you have a good rest of your week, and I hope you have some good practice times.